There's a pattern you'll notice when someone suddenly brings up an argument you thought was already over. You apologized. She said it was fine. Weeks passed, life went back to normal, and then, somehow, in the middle of a completely unrelated conversation, there it is again. The same argument, the same moment, the same thing you thought had already been settled. And your first thought is probably, why are we talking about this again? You assume she's holding a grudge. Maybe she can't let things go. Maybe she's keeping score. But sometimes something much more interesting is happening. She isn't necessarily bringing back the event. She's bringing back the feeling the event left behind, and those are not always the same thing. Think about what usually happens the first time. Something goes wrong. Maybe you were late. Maybe you forgot something important. Maybe you dismissed something she was trying to tell you. Maybe you said something that hurt her. You apologize, and you mean it. You say, "I'm sorry I was late." She accepts it. The conversation ends. From your perspective, the problem has been handled. The event happened, you apologized, case closed. But here's the pattern people often miss. Resolved and understood are not the same thing. You may have apologized for what you did without ever understanding what you did meant to her, and that's where the unfinished part can remain. Because the deeper question isn't always, why were you late? Sometimes it's, why did it feel like my time didn't matter to you? It isn't always, why did you forget? Sometimes it's, why did I feel like I wasn't important enough to remember? And it isn't always, why did you say that? Sometimes it's, why did I feel unheard when I was trying to explain how I felt? The behavior is the surface. The meaning underneath it is often where the emotional weight lives. And when that deeper layer never gets acknowledged, the incident can technically be over, while the feeling attached to it isn't. So the mind does something interesting. It stores the unresolved experience, not necessarily as some deliberate grudge, more like unfinished emotional information. And then, weeks later, something completely unrelated happens. You forget another small thing, you interrupt her, you cancel a plan, you respond in a way that feels familiar, and suddenly, the old argument comes back. This is where it gets confusing. Because from your perspective, the reaction seems completely disproportionate. You're thinking, we're seriously talking about that again? But from her perspective, the new event may not feel entirely new. It may have touched the same emotional pattern. The old moment said, maybe I don't matter as much as I thought I did. The new moment creates a similar feeling, and suddenly the old memory becomes relevant again. Not necessarily because she wants to punish you for the past, but because the present moment has reopened something that never completely closed. And this is where a lot of people make the same mistake. They hear the old argument come back and immediately say, I already apologized for this. Technically, that may be true, and emotionally, it may still miss the point. Because what the other person hears isn't always, I've already taken responsibility. They may hear, I'm tired of hearing how this made you feel. And now something strange happens. The original problem was one issue, but the conversation creates a second one, the feeling of being dismissed for bringing the first issue up. So the argument becomes bigger than the original event. This doesn't mean every time someone brings up the past, they're automatically right. And it doesn't mean every old argument needs to be reopened indefinitely. People can absolutely weaponize the past. People can use old mistakes to punish, control, manipulate, or win unrelated arguments. So this isn't about blindly accepting every accusation. The pattern is more specific. Sometimes an old argument resurfaces because the emotional meaning of the event was never actually understood. And if that's what's happening, arguing about whether the event is technically finished won't solve it, because you're debating the timeline while they're talking about the meaning. That's why a different question can completely change the conversation. Instead of, why are you still bringing this up? Try, what about that still feels unresolved for you? That's a very different question. You're no longer defending the past, you're investigating what remains. And then something important happens. You might discover that she isn't actually angry about the original event anymore. Maybe she's afraid that you'll repeat the same pattern. Maybe she felt unimportant. Maybe she felt like her reaction was treated as an inconvenience. Maybe she accepted your apology before she actually felt understood. Or maybe she simply never felt safe enough to finish saying what the experience meant to her. And that's the part that often gets missed. An apology can acknowledge an action, but understanding acknowledges the impact. Those are different things. You can sincerely say, "I'm sorry I forgot," and still leave someone wondering, "Do you understand why that hurt me?" That's why sometimes the most powerful response isn't another apology. It's curiosity. Tell me what you heard from that situation. What did it make you feel? What do you think I didn't understand the first time? And then comes the hardest part. Listen without immediately building your defense. Because the moment you start explaining why you weren't actually wrong, you may prove exactly what they were trying to tell you. Not that you are a bad person, not that the original event was unforgivable, but that their emotional experience still doesn't feel fully acknowledged. And once that layer is finally understood, something often changes. The conversation stops being about the old argument. It becomes about the pattern underneath it. And that's where the real resolution can happen. Because the goal isn't to make someone forget what happened. The goal is to make sure they no longer have to keep bringing it back just to feel like it was finally understood. That's an important distinction. Forgetting isn't the same as healing, and silence isn't always resolution. Sometimes silence simply means, "I stopped trying to explain this because I didn't think you'd understand." So the next time someone brings up an argument you thought was long finished, pay attention before you react. Don't immediately ask, "Why are we talking about this again?" Ask something more revealing. What does this still mean to you? Because the words might be about the past, but the pattern is usually happening in the present. And maybe that's the real reason old arguments sometimes come back out of nowhere. They're not always asking you to relive the past. Sometimes they're asking you to finally understand what the past was trying to say. Listen for what's underneath the words, because that's usually where the real conversation was waiting the entire time. See what others miss.